He was digging a hole for himself when he heard chains clinking far away. Silas Ward had already scratched his name onto a wooden cross, written a final letter to no one, and accepted he'd die alone on this quiet land. But the sound of metal scraping on stone made him pause with his shovel. His old hands held tight to the handle as sweat fell into the dirt that would soon bury him. The old rancher had been getting ready for this for months. He'd sold his cows, paid off his debts, and burned his will since no one was left to take his troubles. At 68, with a heart that wasn't steady and hands that shook more each day, Silas knew he didn't have much time. The hole he was digging wasn't just a hole. It was his last way to control a life that had taken everything from him. But those chains kept clinking, getting louder, along with the sound of small feet struggling against heavy metal. Silas climbed out of his half-done hole and walked toward the noise, his boots crunching on the dry ground. What he saw made his heart freeze. A girl, maybe 12 years old, stumbled into sight with iron chains on her ankles and wrists. Her dress was ripped and dirty. Her face was streaked with tears and mud. Behind her, 3 men on horses appeared from the dusty heat, their faces hidden under wide hats. The leader, a skinny man with cold eyes, held a chain tied to the girl's collar. The girl's eyes met Silas's across the dusty yard, and in that moment, something passed between them that they didn't quite get. Here was a man ready to end his life, and here was a kid whose life might be ending against her wishes. She was being led like an animal to a bad fate, while he was choosing his own end carefully. Silas felt his heart pounding, but not from his sickness this time. The 3 riders were close enough now that he could see the mean looks on their faces. They looked at the girl like she was something to sell. The leader spat into the dust and shouted something about needing water for their horses. But Silas barely heard him. All he could see was the girl who stopped walking, even though the chain tugged at her neck. She stared at him with eyes full of pain no kid should feel, but also a tiny spark of hope. It was the kind of look that could stick with a man forever or change his whole life. But what she whispered next, so quiet it was almost lost in the wind, changed everything Silas thought he knew about his last days. "Be my dad," she whispered, her voice shaking with a need that cut through the desert air like a knife. The words hit Silas harder than any punch. This kid, tied up in chains and shaking from being so tired, wasn't asking for water or to be freed or saved. She was asking for something bigger and scarier. The leader of the 3 men, who Silas now saw wore a deputy's badge that looked kind of fake, laughed at her words. "Don't listen to her, old man. She's been saying wild stuff all morning. We're taking her to her new family, people who paid good money for a strong worker." Silas felt something heavy in his stomach. Worker. They weren't talking about a real family. They meant slavery, hidden behind fake papers and fake smiles. The girl's eyes stayed on his face, and he could tell she knew exactly what was waiting for her. She picked this moment, this stranger digging his own grave, as her last hope for kindness. The deputy got off his horse and walked closer, his hand resting on his gun. "Name's Clyde Baxter. We need water and supplies. Then we'll leave. No trouble planned." But the way he said it sounded like trouble might come anyway. Silas looked at the girl again, really looked at her under the dirt, and fear. He saw strength in her small body, smarts in her dark eyes, and something else, a stubborn will that reminded him of his late wife. Margaret had looked at him the same way once when they first met, like she saw something in him worth fighting for. The girl took a step forward, even though the chains pulled her back, scraping against the ground. "Please," she said louder now. "I can work hard. I can cook, clean, and take care of animals. I won't cause trouble. Just don't let them take me." Clyde Baxter's face got angry. "That's enough from you." He yanked the chain, making the girl stumble forward. "Old man, we need that water now. Then we're taking our property." Property? The word felt like a curse. Silas felt his hands curl into fists, anger growing inside him like he hadn't felt since they buried Margaret. This girl wasn't property. She was someone's daughter, someone's hope, someone's future being sold to the highest bidder. But Silas was just one old man with a weak heart and shaky hands, facing 3 armed men who had the law on their side. What could he do against them? The smart thing would be to give them water, watch them leave, and go back to digging his grave. But as he looked into the girl's eyes, he realized some choices shape who a man is. And what happened next would decide if Silas Ward died as the sad, lonely man he'd become, or if he could be the protector he always wanted to be. "I don't think I have enough water for all of you," Silas said slowly, his voice calm despite the storm in his chest. It was a lie. His well was full and strong, but he needed time to think, to figure out how to save this kid without getting them both killed. Clyde's eyes got narrow. "That's a problem, old man. We've been riding hard for 2 days, and our horses are worn out. You don't want to be the reason bad things happen when desperate men don't get what they need." The other 2 riders got off their horses now, moving in a way that felt threatening. One was a big man with scars on his knuckles. The other was younger, with eyes that looked empty, like he'd seen too much fighting. They spread out a bit, in a way Silas recognized from his own rough days years ago. The girl, Mercy, seemed to feel the danger growing. She looked between Silas and the men, then did something surprising. She sat down hard in the dirt, her chains rattling, and refused to move. "I'm not going any further," she said, her young voice strong despite everything. "Like heck you're not," Clyde growled, pulling the chain on her collar. But Mercy had wrapped her legs around a fence post, using her small size to hold on. The more he pulled, the more she held tight, her face full of determination. Silas watched this brave kid and felt something break open inside him. Here was a child fighting for her freedom with nothing but stubbornness and hope, while he'd been ready to give up on life. The difference made him feel ashamed in ways he didn't expect. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, girl," the big man growled, stepping forward with a leather strap that looked well used. "We've got ways to make stubborn kids obey." That's when Silas made his choice. He walked to his porch and picked up the old rifle that had been sitting there, dusty, for years. His hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady as a rock as he checked the gun and saw it was loaded. Margaret always told him to keep it ready, even though he never thought he'd need it for more than scaring off coyotes. "Gentlemen," Silas said, his voice loud across the yard with a new strength, "I think there's been a mistake. This young lady just asked to be my daughter, and I'm thinking I'll say yes." The silence that came next was heavy. Even the wind seemed to stop, like the world was waiting to see what would happen. Clyde's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he saw how steady Silas held the rifle. But what none of them knew was that saying yes to Mercy would cost Silas everything he had left, and more than he ever thought he could give. "You can't just take her, old man," Clyde said, his voice less sure now. "We've got papers, legal ones, saying she belongs to the Morrison family up in Silver Creek. They pay good money for her work." Silas kept the rifle aimed at the men while his mind raced. Legal papers meant judges and sheriffs and a system that protected men like these while hurting kids like Mercy. But legal didn't always mean right. Silas had learned long ago that sometimes a man has to choose between the law and what's right. "Funny thing about papers," Silas said, stepping closer to where Mercy still held the fence post. "They burn real easy in this dry air. It's amazing how documents can just vanish." The younger rider with the empty eyes spoke up, his voice cold. "You threatening to burn legal papers? That's a big crime, old man. Could get you in real trouble." Mercy looked up at Silas with something like amazement in her eyes. No one had ever stood up for her before, not when her parents died. Not when the state said she could be sold to the highest bidder. Not during the long trip that brought her here. This old man with sad eyes and a kind voice was willing to risk everything for a stranger. "Tell you what," Silas said, his finger light on the trigger. "I'll make you a deal. You turn around, ride back where you came from, and forget you ever saw this place. In return, I won't have to explain to the territorial marshal why 3 armed men were found dead on my land trying to kidnap a kid." Clyde laughed, but it sounded fake. "You think you can take all 3 of us, old man?" "You're dreaming." Silas smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "Maybe, but I promise not all of you will ride away from here. Question is, which one of you wants to find out if this old rifle still shoots straight?" The tension was tight, like a rope about to break. The big man's hand twitched toward his gun, but Clyde held up a finger to stop him. These weren't real lawmen. They were bounty hunters with fake badges, and they knew killing a man on his own land would cause more trouble than any reward was worth. "This ain't over," Clyde said, backing toward his horse. "The Morrison family paid. You is to deliver the girl, and we don't leave jobs undone. We'll be back with more men, real authority, and enough guns to settle this right." As the three men got on their horses, Mercy finally let go of the fence post. The shackles had cut into her wrists, leaving red marks on her pale skin. She looked up at Silas, with tears running down her face, but they weren't from fear anymore. They were tears of thankfulness mixed with something deeper. "Why?" she whispered as the riders vanished into the dusty haze. "Why would you risk everything for someone you don't even know?" Silas lowered the rifle and looked at this brave kid who had woken something in him he thought was gone forever. The answer came to him clearly. What he said next would tie their lives together in ways neither could imagine. "Because," Silas said, kneeling to look Mercy in the eyes, "sometimes God sends us exactly what we need when we need it most, even when we're too stubborn to ask." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key he'd been carrying for no reason he could explain. It fit the locks on her shackles perfectly, like fate had planned this moment. As the heavy chains fell off her wrists and ankles, Mercy rubbed the sore skin where the metal had rubbed. "I was digging my own grave when you showed up," Silas went on, helping her stand. "Thought I had nothing left to live for, but maybe I was wrong about that." Mercy looked at the half-dug hole, then back at Silas, understanding. "You were going to—" She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. The wooden cross with his name said it all. "Seemed like a good idea this morning," Silas admitted. "Lost my wife 10 years ago. Never had kids. Spent most of my life making mistakes I couldn't fix. But then a brave little girl asked me to be her dad, and everything changed." They walked to the house together, Mercy moving slowly on legs that had been chained for days. Inside, Silas poured her water from his well and watched her drink it like it was something precious. When she finished, she looked around the small cabin with its plain furniture and dusty corners. "It's perfect," she said softly, and Silas knew she meant it. After sleeping on the ground and eating scraps, this simple home must have felt like a castle. But their quiet moment was broken by the sound of horses coming, a lot more than before. Through the window, Silas saw at least a dozen riders coming over the hill, led by Clyde Baxter and a man with a real-looking badge this time. "They came back faster than I thought," Silas muttered, checking his rifle. He had maybe 6 shots, and they had way more men. Even if he was the best shot around, the numbers weren't in his favor. Mercy pressed close to his side, a small hand finding his old one. "I'm not sorry I asked you to be my dad," she said strongly, "even if this is how it ends." Silas squeezed her hand gently. "Neither am I, daughter." "Neither am I." The riders were close enough now that he could see their faces. The man with the real badge looked serious, while Clyde had a mean grin, like he was looking forward to payback. Behind them were men with tough faces, the kind who didn't take prisoners or ask questions. As they surrounded the cabin, Silas realized his choice to protect Mercy had started something that could only end one way. But what he learned in those final moments would surprise even him. The man with the real badge got off his horse and walked toward the cabin with confidence. "Silas Ward," he called. "I'm Marshal Tom Hemley from Silver Creek. Come out with the girl, hands up, no weapons." Silas looked at Mercy, who was holding his hand so tight her knuckles were white. He saw fear in her eyes, but also the same stubborn strength that made him choose her in the first place. "Stay behind me," he whispered, then shouted back to the marshal. "The girl stays with me, Marshal. She's under my protection now." "That's not how the law works, Ward," Marshal Hemley replied. "The Morrison family has legal papers signed by a judge. That girl is their property, bought fair and square. Silas felt his anger flare at hearing Mercy called property. Again, he opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch, keeping Mercy behind him and his rifle ready. "Since when do we buy and sell kids in this territory, Marshal? Last I checked, we fought a war to stop that." "Don't lecture me about the law," Henley snapped. "This is legal indenture, not slavery. The girl works for the Morrison family until she's 18. Then she's free. It's all proper." But Silas could see the truth in the Marshal's eyes. Even he knew this was wrong, but he was following orders from powerful people who controlled judges and made laws to suit themselves. The Morrison family had power that reached far beyond their ranch. Clyde Baxter rode closer to the porch. "Told. You we be back, old man. Hand over the girl, or we take her by force. Your choice." Mercy stepped out from behind Silas, her chin high. "I choose him," she said to all the riders. "Silas Ward is my dad now, and I'm staying with him." Some of the hired men laughed, but Marshal Henley looked uneasy. Something about this was bothering him, and Silas could see him struggling inside. "Marshal," Silas said carefully, "how much do you know about the Morrison family's other workers? Ever check how they're treated? How many make it to 18? Henley's face darkened, and Silas knew he'd hit a nerve. The Marshal had seen things he couldn't forget, but he'd been powerless to stop them because it was all legal. "Enough talk," Clyde cut in, pulling his gun. "We're taking the girl now." But then something surprising happened. Marshal Henley's hand slammed down on Clyde's wrist, stopping him from aiming. "Hold on," the Marshal said firmly. "Nobody draws until I say so." The tension between the two men was sharp and dangerous. Clyde hadn't expected the Marshal he brought to fight back. "What's wrong with you, Marshal? We've got papers." Henley looked at the papers in his hand, then at Mercy standing bravely beside Silas, then back at the papers. What he did next changed everything. The Marshal tore the papers in half, then again, letting the pieces blow away in the wind. "These papers are fake," he said with authority. "The signature of Judge Morrison is forged, and I think the Morrison family has been running an illegal business for years." Clyde's face went white. "You can't do that. Those papers are legal." "No, they're not," Henley said grimly. "I've been investigating the Morrison family for months. 12 kids have vanished from their ranch in the last 2 years. Kids who were supposed to be freed at 18, but never made it." The hired men started shifting nervously on their horses. They'd signed up to catch a runaway, not to be part of something that could get them in big trouble. Some were already backing away. Silas felt Mercy's grip tighten, but when he looked at her, he saw something odd in her face. Not relief, but recognition. Like the Marshal's words confirmed something she already guessed. "Marshal," Mercy said quietly, stepping forward. "What was Judge Morrison's first name?" Henley looked surprised. "Richard. Richard Morrison. Why, child?" Mercy's face crumpled, and she started crying not from fear, but from a deep sadness that seemed to come from her heart. "He was my grandfather," she whispered. "My mom's dad. He sent me away when she died because I reminded him too much of her." The silence was heavy. Even Clyde looked shocked. The judge who signed the fake papers was the same man who sent his own granddaughter to a life of hard work. Marshal Henley took off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. "Dear God," he muttered. "I knew Richard Morrison was corrupt, but I never thought." He looked at Mercy with new understanding. "Child, your grandfather wasn't saving you. He was sentencing you." Silas felt a rage bigger than anything before. This wasn't just about one bad official or one greedy family. It was about a broken system where a grandfather could sell his own kin for money. "What happens now, Marshal?" Silas asked, keeping his rifle ready. Trust was still hard to give. Henley looked at Mercy, then Silas, then the scattered paper pieces. "Now, Mr. Ward, you and your daughter should come with me to Silver Creek. We're going to shut this down for good, and we'll need witnesses." But as they got ready to leave, Clyde made one last desperate move. "You're all forgetting one thing," he growled, pulling a hidden knife and lunging at Mercy. "Dead witnesses can't talk." What happened next would decide if this story ended in victory or tragedy, and if Silas Ward would get to be the dad he always wanted to be. The fight reached its peak, as Silas threw himself between the knife and his new daughter, his heart finally knowing what it meant to have something worth dying for. In that moment, the old rancher, who'd been digging his own grave hours before, learned that sometimes the greatest way to live is to be ready to give everything for someone you love. When the dust cleared, Clyde was out cold in the dirt, stopped by the marshal's quick action. The other riders had run off, not wanting to face the consequences of their part in this corrupt plan. Marshal Henley helped Silas up, seeing the strength in the old rancher's eyes. "Mr. Ward, I think you and Mercy have found something special. After we testify in Silver Creek and shut this down, would you consider making this permanent?" Silas looked at Mercy, who was holding his arm tightly. "Daughter," he said softly, "what do you think? Want to stay with an old rancher who knows nothing about raising kids?" Mercy smiled through her tears, and in that smile, Silas saw his future, not the lonely end he'd planned, but a new start full of purpose, love, and the adventure of being a dad. "Yes, Dad," she said simply. "I'd like that a lot." As they rode towards Silver Creek together, Silas realized salvation sometimes comes in surprising ways. He'd been ready to end his story, but instead, he found the start of the most important chapter of his life. The grave he'd been digging would stay empty. There was too much life left to live. If you like this story about second chances and unexpected family, please think about subscribing to our channel and supporting us with a super chat. Your help lets us share more exciting Western stories, tales that show it's never too late for redemption, courage, or love. Click the video on your screen now to dive into another unforgettable trip through the wild American frontier, where regular people find amazing strength against tough odds.